Today we have with us Research Associate Professor John Murphy, who's extremely productive and has more roles than I have fingers, and therefore I have prepared a whole speech so that I didn't need to memorize everything. So he is from the Department of Anthropology at Northern Illinois University, but he's also a computational engineer at Argonne National Laboratory. He's also affiliated with the research centers at the University of Chicago and Northwestern University. He's an archaeologist, he's a modeler, his primary focus is on agent-based modeling and water management, focusing on the US Southwest, with, for example, his work on the Hohokam, but he also works on the present water day management around management issues in Phoenix, Arizona. But he's dipped his toes in a bunch of things with topics like modeling the population dynamics of pine beetles. To say his interests are broad would be an understatement. He is the PI of many projects, like SureNet. He's the lead developer of the ReadPast HPC agent-based modeling toolkit for high-performance computing platforms. And he also has an edited volume in press called If the Past Teaches, What Does the Future Learn? And for his talk today, he has taken inspiration and also set himself quite an ambitious challenge based on the seminal book by Wengrow and Graeber called The Dawn of Everything. And he'll discuss how agent-based modeling highlights solutions and problems to finding social formations that Wengrow and Graeber say archaeologists overlooked. So this is the third seminar in our series, but we've got one every week, so do join us. And John, over to you. I'll stop sharing our screen.
All right. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you here.
Excellent. And now can everyone see my slides?
Yes.
All right, so we are go for lunch. Is that correct?
We are.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Nick, for that introduction. I guess the part that I will highlight is that I set an ambitious goal, and just to manage expectations, we will fall short of it. But we will have an exciting journey on the way, and it will be good to have a discussion afterwards to see how far we got and how we can push it forward. I have learned from past experience to always do the acknowledgments at the start of my presentations in case I run out of time. Portions of this work that I'm going to be presenting today were funded by the McDonald Foundation, by Arizona State University. Portions were funded by the National Science Foundation, whom I will thank, even though we just got word that they've declined to fund another project that I'm involved in. Portions of the work were also performed under the University of Chicago. And of course, I'm coming from Northern Illinois, which has given me funding to work on things recently. One thing that I do want to make sure to note is that even though I work at Argonne National Laboratory, this work that I'm talking about today is not under that auspice, and so I'm not representing Argonne today. So my own housekeeping done, let's dive in. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about model-based archaeology in general and agent-based modeling in particular. I'm going to give an equally brief discussion of my take on the dawn of everything, reflect a moment on what this all has meant to me before moving into two examples, one of them from the Phoenix, Arizona area, focusing mainly on 700 to 1100 in the Common Era, and then skipping ahead a few centuries, looking at water management in the same place around 2000 Common Era. And then we'll look at those with respect to Graeber and Wengrow's comments. We'll look at what's common between them, and then we'll ask, what is the case for using agent-based modeling as a platform to explore these? And then what is the case against it, or at least kind of against it? and then we'll close and lead into a discussion. So let's see. First, a quick tour of models and modeling in archaeology, with kind of as background this book that came out in roughly 2009, I think, with Tim Kohler and Sander van der Loo editing it, looking at a model-based archaeology of socio-natural systems, and focusing on this dramatic claim that they're making, that there's an entire kind of archaeology called model-based that they are going to focus on. Let me just start my own timer so I don't go too far over your time. So, I want to head this slide models versus science and be a little contentious about it, because I've been quoted as saying that models are not science, which is not to say that they're not scientific and they're not part of science, just that they don't completely subsume science. And I guess I want to state that even more controversially, the epistemological and ontological status of models in science is not fully resolved. The epistemological status, meaning we don't know exactly how we use models to get new knowledge, and the ontological status, meaning that there's even dispute about what constitutes a model. Is it the physical thing that you're looking at? Is it the ideas behind it? Is it something in the relationship between them? Models have a very long history in science and archaeology, and I'm not going to try to recapitulate that today. But I want to focus on a particular kind of modeling, and just to make sure that that kind of modeling is understood, I want to be clear about its definition. So I'm a specialist in agent-based modelings or modeling, or ABM, and ABMs focus on simulating individual behavior from which population behavior is observed to emerge. So a non-agent-based approach would be an equation that describes a supply and a demand curve in economics, whereas an agent-based approach would create 10,000 simulated consumers that might have different incomes and different interests and needs and access to the product, with 10 different sellers who may occupy different locations and have advertising strategies, and be able to explore the implications of changing the incomes or the interests of specific subgroups of the population. That would be an agent-based approach. Agent-based modeling can be very useful when populations are non-uniform, and for certain kinds of modeling, including testing various hypotheses about individual behavior. And they're especially useful when understanding networks. So agents that have kinship or social connections with other agents, information that flows on that network. Agent-based modeling is a key component of that. But in order to do agent-based modeling, a few things are required. One, you have to define your universe of entities. What are the agents? You also have to define their perceptions about their environment, including other agents. They may be able to see agents' locations, but not be able to detect their internal states, for example. And you need to decide on the rules that are governing the agents and what they do in response to what they perceive. There are a few other details, like how you schedule the actions of the agents, but those three are the main keys for us today. So modeling is a funny thing. And this question about the epistemological status of models being uncertain is not, I guess, that controversial. The ontological part, what is a model, maybe, but there's a recognition that modeling is a funny process. So here's a quote from Marco Janssen's book on agent-based modeling that says, some disciplines focus on induction, others focus on deduction, and it's very reasonable to assume that you need both, but maybe modeling is actually a third approach to deriving knowledge by in some way combining most approaches, which is both exciting and also kind of wishy-washy. There's a mode of thinking called abductive that can apply here, and it's basically elucidated by Charles Peirce. But there's a great danger of falling into a model, falling into a pattern of modeling reflected down at the lower left of the slide, which is step one, you build a model. Step two, something happens, and step three, you get knowledge. So within this, Kohler and van der Loo were proposing a model-based archaeology of socio-natural systems, and they were proposing this in the early part of the 2000s. To fully understand how they came to that point is also beyond the scope of this talk. But it happens at multiple scales. So one scale is that there's been a very broad shift in the role of modeling versus the role of theory over the last century or so, going back to logical positivism and the Vienna School versus moving from a syntactic definition of theory to a more semantic definition, and the role of models as being either subordinate to or superior to theory. This has played out over the last 10 decades or so. And we're seeing aspects of that in this notion of a model-based archaeology. But over time, I've become more appreciative of other factors that have fed into this trend. Dramatic changes in computer processing power and in the software available to do different kinds of modeling can't be ignored. The original thing that probably is one of the earliest examples of an agent-based model is an economic model by Thomas Schelling that looked at how a city becomes increasingly segregated over time. And he carried that model out using pennies and nickels on a checkerboard and flipping coins to decide how the agents moved around. That was the limit on agent-based modeling in the 1960s. But in the 1990s, as personal computers became more and more readily available, as software to create what was called object-oriented programming became more common, this notion of agent-based modeling became much more accessible and much more widely used. Also feeding into this trend in archaeology are changes in the data that are available for social science modeling. Data that were inconceivable in the 1950s became available in the 1990s and 2000s, including things like large-scale GIS representations of landscapes, and more recently, data collected from these little spies that we all have on our persons at all times, so that now social science modeling is swimming in data, and this is affecting the kinds of modeling that we do. There have also been changes in the theoretical toolkit that we have for understanding human behavior. There have been changes that have driven some of the questions that we've been asking and changes in who is funding those questions. And these have shaped what modeling is applied to. And there are changes among the skills in social scientists and in modelers and programmers. This is an echo of social science majors, basically, undergraduate social science majors not always being the same people who are computer programmers. And the cultivation of a collection of social scientists who are also adept at computer programming and modeling has been an ongoing project over the last couple of decades. On that note, there is now a glut of people in the physical sciences, especially physics, who are extremely adept at computer programming and who are, what's the word I want to find? Encroaching, investigating, invading, doing a bunch of social science. And so what was a model-based social science a few years ago has become more and more computational, so that agent-based models had their fluorescence in the 1990s and 2000s. And if you ask someone at the time, what is computational social science, they would have said agent-based modeling. More recently, computational social science has broadened to include things like data mining, the broad category of data science, data analytics, also certain applications of artificial intelligence. And with those other aspects, computational social science has sort of come to encompass them, and agent-based modeling has faded a little bit from its preeminent position early on to one of only many other options for computational social science. So within archaeology, agent-based modeling has an active community of very strong proponents. The book on the right came out last fall. Isa Romanowska, Colin Wren, and Stephanie Crabtree, three people I consider colleagues and friends. Well, I haven't met Colin directly. Isa and Stephanie and I have hung out in the requisite way just to claim friendship. I used their textbook in the class that I took in the fall. It is an excellent discussion of agent-based modeling and its application in archaeology. But there's an interesting aspect of this community. This community is organizes sessions at various conferences ardently. There are discussion sections on the applications of agent-based modeling and archaeology. There are discussion sections of technique, but they foster the belief, they strongly believe that agent-based modeling is underutilized in archaeology and that it should become something even more prominent within the field. This is an interesting claim, and it's one that I've grown a little cooler to over time, and we'll explore that sort of later in the talk. Let's see. So, how do I think of models? A reasonable working definition of a model is that they consist of a set of assumptions A that, when followed to their conclusion, result in a set of outcomes B. And that's sort of the very baseline of the way I think about models. And it doesn't matter if this is a model that I write on 10 lines of code or if it's a model that I run on a supercomputer. It's still a large collection of assumptions, some of which are data, some of which are these bits of agent code. And I run them and I see what they end up turning out. This is the population level behavior. But what's important in that framework is to understand that if I have a set of assumptions A and they lead to a set of outcomes B, and I look in the real world and I see that set of outcomes, can I then conclude that my assumptions were the right ones? And that answer is no. Having constructed a model that creates the results B, and then observing B in the real world, you can't assume that A was the actual set of conditions that led to B. This is the problem of equifinality. A may simply be one of any number of possible assumptions that can lead to B. And in the worst case, the set of possible models that lead to an outcome B is virtually infinite. Among modelers, I know one of the training exercises that you give to graduate students is you ask them to model something and they come back with a model and you say, that's great, and you go over it, and then you say, now model the same thing in an entirely different way. And they have to go through the exercise of rethinking all of the entities that they've considered and all of the rules and all of the relationships and coming up with a different kind of model. The fact that you were able to model it, which was sort of the gold standard for a while, can you build a model of X? It's sort of given. You can build a model of it. The question, in fact, you can build many models of it. But the question is, how do you then determine if your model is capturing something in reality? One of the interesting things about models is that you can provide disconfirmation. So someone says you cannot get a result B from a specific kind of A. You cannot, for example, get cooperative behavior among groups of individuals who are acting out of self-interest. Well, you can construct a model where there is a sort of altruistic punishment, and you can show that it leads to a better group level outcome, and you can disconfirm that original statement. One of the fun things about that is that you can make an argument that now you know less than you previously thought you did. So again, how is a model being used to generate new knowledge? So one of the other arguments is that agent-based modeling would be much more widely used if it were just able to overcome these technical issues. People don't know how to write code. They don't know how to do the models. And in fact, the agent-based modeling in archaeology book is about that issue. You can work through the examples and see how all the coding works. And it's written at an entry level, so you should be able to gain facility with it. But my argument is actually that the reason that agent-based modeling is not more widely used in archaeology is because of the boundary that the logic of modeling puts around what you can do with these agent-based models. And I want to look at that proposition in the context of a couple of agent-based models that I've worked on. So let's see. But first, let me talk about this book, The Dawn of Everything. Like my overview of modeling, it's going to be fairly light. In fact, it may be more of a cartoon and even a caricature. But this book is, I think, worth rereading even at something like 700 pages. And I will continue to do so. And I hope that the discussion will keep moving forward, because I think they've given us quite a lot. So the key takeaways for our discussion here. Number one, and very important, the book helps us decolonialize our understanding of interactions with Native Americans by giving them voice, agency, creativity, intellect, and many other things that they have been previously denied. This is one of the things that I feel very strongly about in the book. I am sitting in the middle of what was once Native American heartland. I am in a predominantly white community that exists there because that Native American community was pushed out. We are in the United States going through this exercise of decolonialism. And so I want to make sure to emphasize that that's one of the things that this book gives us. More to their point, though, social arrangements other than hierarchical power and stratified complexity are possible and may have been common. This is one of the big lights that shines from this book. These arrangements rest on and support conceptions of individual liberty that are at variance with the assumptions that we often make when we're looking at the past. What they're talking about is a very different way of organizing societies, one that we may have missed substantially in examples from the past. And finally, that archaeological signatures of these can be recognized and demystified, including, and this is a key one for my own work, large population centers without ready indications of stratified social complexity. This is one of the big mysteries that we'll look at. How did lots and lots of people live and collaborate without an apparent state architecture? I will say that this applied to some of my early work back when I was doing Maya archaeology. I'm focusing on the example from the US Southwest today, but in the Maya case, there's an extensive discussion of archaic states and the various state formations. My own advisor, Pat Colbert, had his views of it. This continues to be an ongoing area of study. I do want to point out many other things that we are not going to get to talk about from Graeber and Wengrow. The larger arguments about the origin and nature and semantic content of slavery, their tripartite conception of power based on charisma, control of violence, control of information, the different ways that archaeologists have confused themselves about the past by forcing their own schema onto it. There's an extensive discussion of dualistic relationships, two societies adjacent to one another, sort of defining themselves in opposition. And last, with a shameless plug, late in the book, they acknowledge the work of Carol Crumley and others who have proposed similar things for quite some time. And the shameless plug of the day, this is a book that Carol and I are working on. Federica has had extensive input into this. We are still wrestling with things like image credits and resolution, but it will be out very soon. And forgive the plug, it will be free, so I'm not, making lucre off of this, but I hope you will get a chance to check it out. So my working definition, the way I'm thinking about it for the purpose of this discussion, is just that Graeber and Wengrow show us a rich collection of social arrangements in the past that were deliberately constructed to maintain complex interactions among individuals and with the environment, often including large populations, without constructing inequality or social complexity in the ways that we've been conditioned to expect, but instead to preserve a social order and liberty that exists in forms that we may only be beginning to understand. In other words, the archaeological record holds a lot of different rich examples that we have missed, and we should be learning more from them. So with that, personal reflection. First, I'm taking a controversial position about agent-based modeling, even though I'm a modeler and count my fellow ABMers as colleagues and friends. I want to engage in this discussion more, and I'm sure that that will play out, but I am sort of staking a claim that this contention that it's just a technical issue is not true. I also want to say that what I'm discussing today is sort of personal in that the two pieces of research that I followed reached a point where I didn't know how to take them much further. There was just a point where I sort of shrugged my shoulders and then became involved in many other things. And the Dawn of Everything, the book, the Graeber and Wengrow book, offer a path forward. In a sense, it's a new hope. It's a new excitement for me. So I'm very excited about this path. And I hope that in the course of this talk, you'll see why. So let's shift gears and talk about a real archaeological example, the Hohokam. And I again want to comment that the term Hohokam remains in common use, but it is problematic. It was imposed by archaeologists. It implies that the people of the past are gone. The word itself means all used up. It is not the term that the indigenous peoples living in the area prefer. It is in the literature. I have named my model that, so I will use it here on this slide, but I don't discuss it. I don't use it very much afterwards because it is contentious. So the Hohokam were farmers in Arizona. Arizona, as you probably know, is basically a desert. It's the northern reach of the Sonoran Desert. But evidence for occupation goes quite far back into the first millennium BCE. The cultural connections among this group were stronger to Mexico than to the rest of the US Southwest. And the distinguishing feature was the construction and operation of very large-scale canals, especially along the Salt River, although the earlier ones were in the Tucson area, and the Salt River that we're looking at mainly today is northern area in Phoenix. So here's a map purloined from Google Earth. The bottom left of the slide is the Gulf of Mexico for reference, and the yellow line is the Mexico-Arizona border. Phoenix is the large city in the top center. I've also indicated the location of the Colorado River on the far western side. The Salt River, sort of vaguely delimited over on the right. The Salt River flows to the west. It eventually joins the Gila River and flows into the Colorado before trying to flow into Mexico, but probably not succeeding these days because we take all the water out of it. Tucson is farther down and to the right, but it is useful to know that even though it's downward on the map, it's upward in actual elevation. Tucson is about 300 meters higher than Phoenix, which will be important in a moment. So the problem is not on your screen. This is a horrible photo that I took of the Hohokam canals. I apologize for the quality. This is a snapshot that I took in the visitors center. It's the only rights-free image that I can really find. But the main point is that there is the Salt River flowing east to west in the Phoenix area, and there are two large branches of canal systems that come off of it. One heads to the north. The yellow arrows indicate where it's being branched off around what's now Tempe, Arizona. And then the longer yellow area indicates that this canal system actually kept going. This is a map of archaeologically recovered canals, which is how you can get things like canals that cross one another. Time is very squashed in this. This is centuries upon centuries of canals, but some of these canals could exceed 20 to 30 kilometers in length. That's not a small system. The orange arrow is Canal System 2, which branches off from the south bank and heads southward down toward I forget the name of the modern town. It's been more than a decade since I lived in the Phoenix area. But it heads south downward from Tempe to Chandler. That's it. And it looks like there are more canals in that. It looks again, it's very blurry, but it looks like there are many more canals. That's because they did a major archaeological project there and they recovered much more archaeological evidence. The canals are sort of permeating through this area. So here's what it looks like on the ground today. The upper photo is a picture standing basically at the beginning of that yellow area and looking along one of the canal systems. The key, though, is to just understand that canals required extensive labor and coordination. At one point, there was a hypothesis that canals became large because they started small and they expanded over time, but it turns out you can't do that. You can't build a small canal and then make it into a big one. If you're going to build a big canal, you have to build a big canal. So these canals were built in large construction events. This is manual labor with baskets and digging sticks. It would have required a lot of people. Maintaining the canals also required a lot of people. And even with maintenance, canals had a use life. And when that use life was exhausted because the canals silted up or eroded away, you needed to rebuild. And often a new canal would be rebuilt basically a few yards away from the old canal. So this is an ongoing process that requires a lot of people and a lot of coordination. But despite the need for large-scale labor and coordination, there does not seem to have been a state that controlled these aspects of the canal system. So sorry, Wittfogel, the hydraulic hypothesis doesn't play out here. There are some platform mounds in the later periods that indicate some social stratification, but most of the big canals are early. There's no writing, there's no evidence of a palace bureaucracy. Some of the large centers are at the heads of the canals, while others are at the tails. And all of this is sort of in violation of what we have come to think of characterizing irrigation societies. There are a number of other questions for this archaeological record. The society underwent a transition around 1100 in which residential structures and many other aspects of the society, like rituals and disposal of the dead, changed dramatically. So the form of house on the left of this slide is called a pit house, and it is essentially abandoned and replaced with this sort of pueblo construction, not with the overhead electric power lines, but with this walled enclosure and this different form of housing, indicating probably a different set of social arrangements. But the basic structure of the canal system wasn't changed. And this persisted for another couple of hundred years, but then there is another transition that's often characterized as a collapse because the canal system falls into disuse and the population of the valley decreases dramatically. So in 2003, when we were looking at this, in keeping with current theory on self-organized systems, I started a dissertation project where we attempted to answer questions about this through modeling. The idea was, let's build a model of operating the Hohokam canals, and let's see if we can understand the principles by which all of this labor could have been coordinated, and address this question of, you cannot get a large-scale coordinated canal system without a central state controlling it, by building a simulation that allowed exploring scenarios where small micro-level decisions led to a larger coordination without necessarily having a central organizing body performing this. And this is all based on my advisor, Steve Lansing's similar work in Bali. So we built the simulation. In the simulation, I identified entities, and the entities were rivers and water and gates along the rivers that directed water into the canals, fields and soil in which plants and crops would grow, and agents that could manage this system by diverting water or building canals or planting crops. There's a sort of set of dynamics that go along with this, that rivers provided the water through the gates that arrived on the fields, that changed the field characteristics, and agents could represent the farmers to make these decisions. So prepare to be underwhelmed again, because this is the graphic output of the model. There's a question in modeling about richness of detail versus abstractness. So this is obviously very abstract. The Salt River has become a single horizontal line that goes through the middle. And the two canal systems, one branching off to the north and one branching off to the south, are just reflected in this very sort of schematic of blue lines leading to distribution canals that deposit water onto the individual fields. In this particular image, the shading on the fields indicates how much water they've received, with the upstream fields getting more water than the downstream fields, which is pretty typical and characteristic of what you would expect in a canal system. I've also reversed the direction. So in the real world, the northern system is downstream of the southern system in terms of their takeoff points. But we can talk about the upstream and the downstream. And the interesting thing to look at was this relationship between the upstream and the downstream. So what were the things that could change in this model? Well, you could change which crops were being grown. And this mattered because different plants had different water requirements and different schedules on which they would receive water. You could change things like the rates at which canals would fail. but you could also change the efficiency of gates in diverting water at various levels. So if the river is 100% full, I can only take 30% of it off, but if the river is 50% full, I can take 80% of that. We didn't know a lot about these diversion gates, and so there was a question of how effective they would be. We could look at the nutrient and pollutant content of the river water, but we could also look at the seasonal flow rates for the rivers, and we could look at the annual variation in flow. This is derived from tree ring information. You could say that there were some years that were very wet and other years that were very dry. And then you could speculate about how the water was coming down the river within the year. Was February a very wet month versus March versus April? And then for the agents and their activities, you could change the apportionment strategy among the fields. Turn taking or random, or just allowing the last fields to fail. So if we put those up with the image, you can imagine that if different individuals own each of the distribution canals, then the ones in the upstream might just take the water because they have the branching point, and only let the ones downstream have water once their needs are fulfilled. On the other hand, if I'm a farmer and I, through inheritance or marriage or whatever, own fields that are both upstream and downstream, then I may have an interest in a different arrangement for moving water around, and I may have to negotiate that with the other members of the canal community. There's a physical component because you can only divert water at specific points, but there's mainly a social component about who gets to have the water when. So what did I learn from this? Well, one thing that's not very interesting, but maybe a little interesting, given specific assumptions about the efficiency of the gates and the flow rates of the river, during certain periods, meaning these wet versus dry periods, the downstream branch could actually be shown to get more water. It depended on what assumptions you made about the efficiency of the gates and the intra-annual distribution of water. But basically, there were periods of time, sometimes even decades, where the downstream might be doing better. But this leaves a lot of space to explore. Essentially, the conclusion is it's very complicated. So I built it to accumulate more data. I put an online interface. You could log into the web. You could put in information about crops and plants. It was beautiful. It was wonderful. I'm still proud of it to this day, and no one used it. So after 2009, I sort of moved on to other things, including moving forward in time with water management in the Phoenix area. So let's talk a little bit about why there's a giant city in the middle of the desert. Water management in Phoenix is also complex. Many canals actually follow the same basic contours as the Hohokam canals, and this is deliberate because Phoenix was built where it was built because of this canal system. But the sources of water are now very different. And water consumption and water allocation is sort of based on history. There were these little towns around Phoenix that existed as separate municipalities, and they managed their own water. And the fact that they've now all sort of grown to one giant metro area doesn't change the administrative fact that they have different populations they're responsible for. Other places like Las Vegas have said, okay, we're getting rid of these little water managers and we're just going to manage the whole thing as one unit. But Phoenix hasn't done that. So here's a map of contemporary canals in Phoenix, and you can see that they do sort of show what was at least implied by the fuzzy picture that I showed earlier. Part of this is to be expected because it follows the topography of the landscape, but it's also an example of endurance. The Hohokam built their canals, Phoenix built on top of that, and this is all a continuing effort in one sense, even if the populations have changed. One thing that's changed is that moving water around in the Phoenix area is no longer a physical problem. There are pipes, there are pumps, there are canals. You can move the water wherever you need. But water law, where the water goes, is extremely complex. And this derives from the fact that water is not like many other resources. It's not strictly a commodity. Denying somebody water when it would kill them to keep them thirsty is morally out of bounds. On the other hand, water is priced and it is owned. And so there has to be some set of arrangements to move water around. And it turns out that in the West of the United States, those arrangements are thorny. So here are some aspects of water in the US Southwest. One, water rights are based on priority. Who used the water first? If two entities share rights to water, like I have 5 units of rights and you have 2, if the water supply is short of the total amount, the one with the lower priority loses all of its water before the other loses any. So it isn't split proportionally. If there's less than 7 units of water, we don't divide it up halvesies. You lose all of yours before I lose any of mine. In order to get the water, you have to show that you're putting it to a productive use. And if you don't productively use it, then someone else will be allowed to use it. So if I said, well, I'm not using all 5 units of water, you might want to get it, but you actually can't have it unless I'm not putting it to a productive use, in which case you might be able to step in and claim it. But one of the odd effects is that keeping unused water in Lake Mead, which I would point out is a reservoir, which is a thing designed to keep water, was basically illegal until a recent agreement changed that. So Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, all states that have rights to water in the Colorado River, California, weren't allowed to just say, we're not going to use all of our water this year, let's keep some in Lake Mead. That was basically illegal, and someone would take the water out. This led to a bizarre situation where Arizona found a productive use in recharging their aquifers, pumping the water out of the Colorado River and pumping it into the ground. And again, this comment that I made about going down on the map is actually going uphill. 7% of the energy use in Arizona was at one point used to move water around. And so instead of just keeping the water in Lake Mead, they were pumping it and then putting it into the ground. This allowed other states to use Arizona as a kind of bank, where they entered into a financial arrangement so that Arizona could store the water for them. They didn't actually, of course, pump the water back upstream. They just made an arrangement to take it out later on. Most entities in this environment attempt to collect a diverse portfolio of water rights and priorities. So Phoenix has, a certain number of acre feet that they get from this source on this priority, and a certain number on this source on this priority, and so on down the line, banking against the idea that some of them are going to fail in any particular year. And last, this is highly contentious, and there's a saying, whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting, because all of this gets played out in the courts, and it's a legal mess. So let me talk a little bit about this canal to get water from Colorado to Phoenix. There is the Mark Wilmer pumping plant, which runs continuously and pumps water 1,100 feet uphill so that it can start to flow downward. There are pumping plants along the way, but the pricing, because water is one of these unusual commodities, the pricing is postage stamp. Everybody pays the same. Even though Tucson is 100 miles farther and several meters higher, it's agreed that everybody pays the same rate for the water. More importantly, water has to be scheduled in advance. You have to schedule it with the federal agency that controls the Colorado River, and you have to provide your schedule month by month in October of a given year for the following calendar year, which means that you have to estimate how much you're going to use in August, nearly a year in advance. Predicting this demand is very inexact. Moreover, excess water that you schedule but don't use is still charged. You still end up paying for it, although a slightly lower rate. You can go over or under any month, but if you're short at the end of the year, or you can't be over, they won't deliver it, you've got a problem of one kind or another. But water isn't a commodity, so even if you're going to be short, you're not allowed to just sell your water. It's all governed by this complex system of rights. We heard whispers that this was actually a little more contentious than we knew about on the surface. And so we wanted to explore how this sort of slop in prediction might play out. So to do this, we created a simulation model to distribute the excess water. Every month, starting in July, if your town expected that you had scheduled too much water, that you weren't going to use it all, you could essentially offer it back to a pool. If your town expected a shortfall, you could ask for some of the extra. This is entirely hypothetical. We had to make that clear because I think it's kind of illegal. But In the real world, most of these players would balance this from other parts of their portfolios. This is only cap water. And so it's not real. But the interesting thing is, can we construct a scenario that is fair? You can offer, you can get back. And in fact, we set it all up so it's proportional. If two entities asked for, let's say, 10 units and 5 units, but only 9 units ended up being available, then they would be apportioned 6 and 3, so that one gets 2/3 and one gets 1/3. It's as close to fair as we can get. So what happens when you play out according to these rules? Well, the agents are going to try to minimize their excess and their shortfalls by changing the ways that they request water. So we allowed this to iterate over and over multiple years. Requesting water could be triggered by larger or expected shortfalls. If you're only going to be 2% short, you might not ask for more water, but if you're going to be 20% short, then you would. What's the threshold? And likewise, offering water, if it looks in July like you're going to be 2% over, do you offer that, or do you hedge your bets and hang on to it? The amount requested could be a fraction of your shortfall, or the amount offered could be a fraction as well. But basically, if you ended up losing the game in a particular year, you would change your strategy. If you ended up with asking for not enough water, you would ask for more the next time you hit the same conditions. What happens when you let this play out? Well, one thing that happens is that the agents sort of can be categorized by this character of generous versus not generous. And a generous agent asks for very little and offers a lot. And a stingy agent doesn't ask for, or asks for a lot and offers very little. This is the kind of thing that you would see in these water conflicts, that there's distrust among the players and there's a question of why are they doing the things that they're doing. But we ran this in the simulation. Now these graphs I'm very proud of because they're almost indecipherable. But what's happening here is we've got a map of the strategy. The amount to return is how much you offer. The amount to obtain is how much you're asking. And you can start off in one quadrant asking a lot and offering very little. But if you start where the star is, then over time, your strategy migrates based on how well you're doing. And what we found is that if you play this over and over, the results end up being very consistent. It's based on population size. Small cities, large cities, medium cities end up having different strategies that are very consistent no matter where they start in terms of whether they're generous or not. They end up playing the same kinds of strategies, but the strategies are different for different players, which means that what you might see and think is an aspect of character, they don't offer very much, they're always asking for water, is actually an aspect of the outcome of the dynamics. Here is a graph of populations, the different populations and where they tend to show up. No matter where you start, no matter what the other agents are doing, this is where you're going to end up. So what are the common threads between these two products? Well, they both propose hypothetical but plausible dynamics. I can have my field managers take turns dividing up water, closing gates at specific times, but I made all that up. It's plausible, but I made it up. Just like I made up this notion of how to exchange water back and forth among the water managers in the Phoenix area. The outcomes are difficult to anticipate because they depend on the complex interactions. They indicate that you could add richer detail. What if I had different portfolios, but was playing against the same players who also had different portfolios? All these projects, however, stopped short of adding this detail, deferring the question of where to go next. And all of them also admit that they're only one possible scenario out of a virtually infinite array of other scenarios. Which brings us back to what would Graeber and Wengrow say? Well, they would certainly say that the construction of an elaborate system of management of a resource that is not driven entirely by market concerns is entirely keeping with what they're discussing. Past societies were managing their relationships among each other. They were managing their environment. They were managing these resources. They were, as far as we can tell, not using pure laissez-faire capitalism. Whether there was a market strategy involved or not is often ambiguous, but that these were being done deliberately with specific concerns of equity, just like you can't, price people out of water so that they die. This is all in keeping with what Graeber and Wengrow are discussing. So what is the case for using agent-based models? Well, in the name agent-based, there is an agentive capacity of the actors that is very similar to what Graeber and Wengrow say we should be endowing our understanding of the past with, that these solutions were designed deliberately by facultative and motivative and intentional agents. And probably in agent-based modeling, you would be able to capture that with an asterisk. But also that the range of complex solutions to resource management and to exchange in the real world is very wide. ABM can capture those to show that they functioned effectively, to show how they operated and how they maintained their effectiveness. So there are some specific examples in the Graeber and Wengrow book. We could build agent-based models of the exchange of bread within a particular village or the other kinds of things that they describe. We could ask, would that have worked? The problem is that the kind of agency in agent-based models isn't really the kind that designs the rules. The agents in our systems play out the rules, but they don't design those systems. That's not the kind of agency that we give them. We also can't really understand what those agents were perceiving about their worlds and how they moved from those perceptions to designing these systems that addressed the issues that they were facing. Now, I need to put a small little coda on this, because right now in the agent-based modeling world, there's a movement towards something called inverse generative approaches. This is being pushed by some of the same people who pushed agent-based modeling originally. And the idea is that in inverse generative social science, you actually can generate the rules. And there's an aspect of this that's data mining. You use artificial intelligence to sort of play out all the possible rule variations. This is especially appealing in digital environments. So if you're looking at online behavior in Twitter and things like that, where the world is already discretized, it's already broken up into units for you. But I would argue that the rules that you're finding are only a part of an agent-based model. The other part is this perceptions of the world. This again is an epistemological question. In what units did the people of the past perceive their world? I alluded to things like kinship, my ownership of the field being related to my family ties. All of that are the pieces out of which these power structures and these sets of resource management strategies would have been built. And many of them are invisible to us, and I think far too rich for some speculative data mining approach to come up with for us. So where does that leave ABM? Well, I think that rather than ABM being a powerful but sort of frustrated tool in archaeology that should be taking over much more of the world than it actually is, I think it's really just one tool among many, able to evaluate particular hypotheses, but needing partners to generate hypotheses and understanding for it. And I would say that this is not probably going to be controversial for my friends and colleagues. They understand the role of integrating modeling with other avenues of inquiry in archaeology, including ethnographic collaborations with indigenous peoples, and seeing it as part of a large body of effort. I do think, though, that the agency of agents in our agent-based models is likely too limited to capture the creativity of those who built and lived in past systems. This is in part just a modeler's perspective. The people in the past are more creative than I was, and I'm not going to be able to make my agents be as creative as they were. And last, I think that there is some inspection to be done, some introspection to be done about how we've designed these models to capture the kinds of complexity that we're accustomed to, as opposed to thinking about models that would reach for different kinds of complexity that we may be newly recognizing in the past. So, closing comments. To me, this book shines a light back on things that I was excited about when I tried a modeling approach to them, but it shines a new kind of light that I'm interested in pursuing further and re-engaging with some of those older topics. But it also impacts newer topics. We are today consistently trying to design new resource management strategies, new institutions that can effectively manage our environment, allocate scarce resources, and manage the social relationships that inhere among them. We do it, we hope, today grounded in concepts like environmental justice and energy justice and equity. And those are a new vocabulary that we work within to try to build these systems. But every new infrastructure system, every forward-looking thought on how we prepare to adapt to climate change is, in a sense, constructing these same kinds of systems. I think that agent-based modeling can play a role in that as well. But I also think that we need to draw more inspiration from past societies, look at them in new ways, as Graeber and Wengrow have offered us, to understand what's possible as we look toward an uncertain, but I hope sustainable future. And with that, I think I'll stop and take questions. I see people clapping. It's muted. It's disheartening.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much. We now open the floor for questions. If we have any in the room live, or Fede will look at the chat. But otherwise, I can start off with John, you mentioned that you put online to model kind of flow and plant use and all that. Could you tell us a bit more about kind of that part? There's quite a few of us here working around irrigation systems who I think would find that interesting and useful.
Sure. So as I said, I'm a bit proud of this, perhaps unduly so, but I recognized very early on that even though it was my dissertation project, it was for others. It was for people who were deeply immersed in the people under study, the Hohokam, the Oodom, and they were the possessors of the expertise. I also recognized that the data sets were going to continue to grow through time. So instead of trying to write a one-off simulation, I wrote a framework. I don't know a better way to put it. In terms of what I put online, there was, for a period of time, and I could resurrect it at some point, I think it all still runs, a web interface. You could log in and you could interact with this model and run simulations and test scenarios. You could put in different components representing each of those entities. So suppose you wanted to understand not farming maize, but looking at some other crop, I think, I don't know, cotton. You could find a way to describe cotton in terms of its water schedule. And there was a framework online that allowed you to put in a new kind of plant and specify different periods of that plant's life and how much water it needed during each of those periods and how much that would impact its growth. And then you could put that in and play it out with some other scenario, perhaps not even a scenario that you had designed. So if someone else had gone in and talked about, you know, I have a different reconstruction of the intra-annual flow along the Gila River. So let's try how cotton farming would have operated with this different level of flow. And then someone else could put in, well, I want very stingy agents who are always taking the upstream water for themselves. Or I want to try it with a different arrangement where we cycle through the different distribution canals. All of this was available online. All of it was auditable so that you could propose a scenario. You could change it up until the point that you or someone else had run it, at which point it became fixed so that no one could then alter it, so that you could maintain an audit trail showing exactly how you got the results that you got. And the idea was to make this a living, growing exercise, that as more data came in, if someone got for example, as actually happened in Tucson, they discovered an entire field system. And so you could put in the specifics of a field system instead of just making up that abstract one. All of that was available online, and I still think that it's in some ways the way that simulation modeling needs to be done. In parallel, there's an effort going on. Some people that I've worked with, Marco Janssen is among them, who have promoted interoperability in models. And I find that a little less compelling because I think it is, again, a technological solution when the real issue is resolving the different units of analysis and bringing the community together. As I said, I'm very proud of that system, but the problem is that most archaeologists prefer to go work on real things rather than sit at their computers and design alternative scenarios. But it's still a useful way of thinking about modeling and thinking especially about how to maintain the audit trail as you take the model in different directions.
Great, thank you. I see we have a question in the chat. By Ezra. So Ezra, if you unmute yourself.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can
Yes,
hear
I
you.
can.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for a lovely lecture on agency-based modeling and returning to the Hohokam, subject of which and water, which I have long been interested in. My question actually has to do with agency-based modeling and other ways of thinking about this kind of simulation. Sasha Dachenko and Oliver Nukowitz over in Kiel and I have been working on simulation models of migration in Central Europe in about 3000 BC. One of the things that we have tried to do is not only do agency-based modeling, but we've decided to allow people to have group decisions. And what we have found is that by group decisions, we found that there's quite different kinds of results under the same set of assumptions that we would get under individual decisions by agency-based modeling. And I was wondering if you've been doing any work along the same general lines. Thank you.
Not currently, certainly not in the specifics of migration. I think the sort of broader issue, though, of what is the unit of decision making is one that agent-based models contribute to in a lot of different contexts. There's a notion of the wisdom of crowds, the idea of, should I do what I think? Should I follow the people who are around me? On a slightly smaller scale, there are pedestrian evacuation models that are all about, what's my goal? What do I think is going on based on other people? And this notion of the larger group as processing the information with individuals processing information at a
Separately, right.
is one that is ripe. I guess the question that I would have, sort of turning it back, is individual versus group. How are you defining the group, and what are the different possibilities for that might exist at levels in between or above that you're looking at? And this is where my argument about the Graeber and Wengrow book is that we see lots and lots of different ones, and they can be selected based on the problem. And so that is, I think, an interesting way forward, but also a harder nut to crack.
Thank you. Just to answer your question, we do both the follow the group, follow the individual model, but we also do actual intentional group decision making, and then combine that with the individual agents, and get quite, as I said, we get quite different results than we do. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Johannes Steinmüller.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Hans. Actually, this appears as Johannes. My name is Hans. I'm an anthropologist in London, and this was fascinating. Thank you so much. It's really great to learn about your work and modeling in relation to Graeber and Wengrow and the Dawn. So I found this really exciting. What is possible. Can I just ask kind of a question of understanding, if I understood this right, the core question of central states and complexity? your project in 2003 was to prove this assumption wrong that you need to have a central state so as to get at a large-scale coordinated canal system. And because you showed that a simulation is possible of such a canal system without a central state, that kind of proves the thesis. So why is that proving Lansing wrong? I thought Lansing was doing a kind of a similar thing in Bali, if I understood that correctly. I mean, and secondly, the much bigger question is what does that mean for kind of the questions that Graeber and Wengrow ask? I mean, it's as you said, it's within the limits of what agent-based modeling can do. It's just providing a kind of a counterexample that this is possible. It could have been like a complex system without a state, but it doesn't prove it. It doesn't say that it actually ever existed in history.
Right. So to the first part of your question. So Steve Lansing was my advisor, and it was through Steve Lansing that I became involved in some workshops that were held at Arizona State University that focused on the Hohokam and that raised this issue, that raised this idea of building this model. Lansing, of course, was working in the well-known Balinese water temple simulation, which has in common this notion of exploring local decisions and understanding the emergence of an optimal outcome. I would say that the Balinese example does kind of the same thing. It shows that it's possible to get this, this optimized system using just local level decisions. But it doesn't go so far as to claim that that's how the actual Balinese water temple system worked. In fact, the Balinese water temple system worked through a sort of much more complicated collection of ritual activities than are actually contained in the simulation model. The Hohokam simulation was presented with this idea that here's an archaeological example that doesn't appear to have a state in terms of the hallmarks that we look for in the archaeological record. So maybe there's this other possibility. Maybe it's also a self-organized system. The simulation that I built was intended to explore those possibilities. I won't say that it got there. So for example, I mentioned that it's possible to specify the rate at which canals degrade and the amount of labor that you have to put into them. But all of that was sort of in the to-do file. Anyone could have logged into that wonderful web system and performed, whatever exploration that they wanted to out of it, but I never got the chance to, and so that's never been done. My point about the logic is, I guess, a burden of proof issue. If your assumption is there's no way this could have been done without a central state, which incidentally, my advisor, Pat Colbert, was very confident that the Maya had this very strong central state. They were so powerful that they never needed to talk about how powerful they were. The burden of proof sort of shifts to, well, I think it could have been one of these weird self-organized systems. But what if they're not weird? What if archaeologists have just missed them? Graeber and Wengrow, point out that archaeologists talk about transition periods that are sometimes thousands of years long. We should look at those as periods where things worked really well and ask how they worked really well. And so I think that the burden of proof sort of shifts back the other way, that we may be more comfortable seeing these large population centers without a state level organization, because in fact, we're sort of conditioned to think states good because we live in states, and states common because we see them all over today. But in fact, in the past, there may have been lots of different ways of arranging life on the landscape and life through time. Graeber and Wengrow talk about this seasonality. And if we expand our possibilities, our world of possibilities to include those, then that changes what are you trying to prove with a simulation like the Hohokam model. Does that make any sense? Okay, good.
We have time for one more short question. In the audience, anybody raises their hand? No? Okay, then we'll thank John by clapping again.
Thank you.
This time you heard it, which is good. And next week we have with us Professor Habu, who will be talking about the Jomon culture in Japan. So please do come again next week, Thursday at 4 British Standard Time. And